Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're getting into something really fundamental.
We're tackling the standard model of particle physics. It's quite a big topic.
Definitely. And we're basing this discussion on, well, basically the Wikipedia article covering this whole framework.
Right. And our mission really is to break it down. What is this model? What are the key bits, the particles?
And figure out what it explains so well, but also crucially, where it falls short. We want this to be, your fast track to understanding these building blocks of everything.
Exactly. A solid handle on the basics as we understand them today.
Okay, let's dive in. So the standard model. At its core, it's our current best theory for the smallest stuff.
That's right. The fundamental particles and how they, interact. It covers 3 of the 4 fundamental forces we know about.
3 out of 4. So electromagnetism.
Yep, that one.
Right.
And the weak nuclear force and the strong nuclear force.
Okay.
And it doesn't just describe the forces, it also gives us a whole catalog, a classification of all the known elementary particles. All the known ones. But straight away, we should probably mention what it doesn't cover, because that's important too.
Absolutely essential. The big one is gravity.
Right. Doesn't fit in somehow.
Not really, no. See, the standard model is a quantum theory deals with the very small probabilistic world. Gravity, as we understand it best through Einstein's general relativity, is, it's classical. It's about space-time geometry.
And merging those 2 views, quantum gravity, that's still a major, major hurdle for physics.
But one of the biggest. We just haven't cracked how to consistently combine them in this framework.
And there are other, cosmic-sized gaps too, right? Things that make up most of the universe.
You mean dark matter and dark energy.
Yeah.
And you're absolutely right. The standard model doesn't have a particle that fits the bill for dark matter.
Which is supposedly, 5 times more common than regular matter?
Something like that, yeah. And dark energy, the thing making the universe expand faster and faster. The standard model has no explanation for that either. And there's a whole matter-antimatter thing. Why is there so much stuff and so little anti-stuff?
Another deep mystery. The model allows for some asymmetry, but not nearly enough to explain the universe we see. So yeah, it leaves some huge questions unanswered.
You also mentioned neutrinos. They were a bit of a headache for the original model.
They were. The classic standard model said they should be massless, but then experiments showed they change type, they oscillate.
Which means they must have mass.
Exactly. A tiny mass, but not 0. So the model had to be, let's say, adjusted. You can add neutrino masses in, but it wasn't an original prediction. Feels a bit tacked on.
So powerful, definitely, but incomplete. And it wasn't just one person's idea, this whole thing. It sounds like it grew over time.
Oh, absolutely. Decades of work, mostly in the second half of the 20th century. Lots of different people, theoretical ideas, experimental discoveries, all building on each other.
You can go way back, can't you? Like Paul Dirac in 1928.
With his equation for the electron, yeah. It had these weird extra solutions.
Which turned out to predict antimatter, the positron, just from the maths.
An incredible moment, theoretically, and later confirmed by experiment, of course. Then, jumping ahead to the 50s, you had Yang and Mills doing crucial work on gauge theory.
Gauge theory, that's about symmetries, right? Which are fundamental to how forces work.
Precisely. It provides the mathematical language for describing forces in quantum field theory. And around the same time, 1957, Chien-Shiung Wu's experiment showed something really surprising.
What was that?
That parity symmetry is violated in weak interactions. Basically, the weak force can tell the difference between left and right.
Wow. Like looking in a mirror and seeing something different happen.
Kind of, yeah. It was a shock, but absolutely key to understanding the weak force. Then Sheldon Glashow in '61 started to link things up.
He tried to unify electromagnetism and the weak force.
He made the first steps,
Yeah.
laying the groundwork for what became the electroweak theory.
And then a few years later, 1964, quarks arrive on the scene.
Proposed independently by Murray Gell-Mann and George Zweig, these tiny constituents inside protons and neutrons.
And someone else, Greenberg, introduced color charge around them.
Implicitly, yes.
Yeah.
This new kind of charge needed for quarks to explain how they bind together via the strong force. It's not actual color, obviously, just a name.
It's just a label, so the theories were evolving.
And then in 1967, a big leap. Stephen Weinberg and Abdus Salam, working independently, figured out how to incorporate something called the Higgs mechanism.
Ah, the famous Higgs.
Into Glashow's electroweak framework, yes.
Yeah.
This was the missing piece needed to explain how particles could actually have mass within the theory.
Because originally the symmetry required them to be massless, right?
Many of them, yes. The Higgs mechanism breaks that symmetry in a specific way, allowing mass. It was a huge theoretical breakthrough.
And then came the experiments, finding the particles the model predicted. That must have been exciting.
Incredibly. The GIM mechanism involving Glashow, Iliopolis, and Maiani predicted the charm quark in 1970, and it was found.
And neutral weak currents, a key prediction of the electroweak theory.
Discovered at CERN in 1973. Big confirmation. Led to the Nobel Prize for Glashow, Salam, and Weinberg in '79.
And the W and Z bosons themselves, the actual carriers of the weak force, they were predicted but not seen for a while.
Predicted with specific masses, yes, and then boom, found at CERN in 1983, right where the theory said they should be. Massive particles, just as expected.
What a confirmation. And the discoveries kept rolling in. Bottom quark, tau lepton.
Tau lepton in '76, bottom quark in '77, the top quark much later in '95. It was so heavy. The tau neutrino finally pinned down in 2000.
And the capstone, the one everyone was waiting for.
A Higgs boson, theorized way back in '64, but finally definitively discovered at the Large Hadron Collider, again at CERN, in 2012.
50 years later. Its discovery really felt like it completed the set, didn't it?
It did. It was the last elementary particle predicted by the Standard Model to be found.
And the name itself, Standard Model, apparently only really came into common use around 1975.
Yeah, about then. Once the core structure, especially the electroweak part in QCD for the strong force, was largely in place.
Okay, so that's the history in a very quick nutshell. Now let's meet the cast, the particles themselves.
Right, the elementary particles. The model sorts them based on properties, spin being a key one, and you get two main families, fermions and bosons.
Fermions. I tend to think of those as the matter particles, the stuff. Is that fair?
That's a good way to think about it, yeah. They have half-integer spin, like spin 12, and they follow the Pauli exclusion principle.
Which means?
No two identical fermions can be in the exact same quantum state at the same time. It's why matter is stable, why electrons and atoms have shells. They can't all just pile into the lowest energy level.
Ah, okay. Makes sense. So bosons are different.
Yep, they have integer spin 0, 1, 2, and they don't follow the Pauli principle. You can cram as many identical bosons into the same state as you like.
Which is important for things like lasers.
Yep. Exactly. Lasers, superfluids, superconductors. These rely on bosons behaving collectively. The force carriers we'll talk about are bosons, and so is the Higgs.
Okay, let's stick with the fermions first. The matter particles. 12 of them in the model.
12 fundamental fermions, yes. Plus each one has an antiparticle partner.
Right, antimatter.
And these 12 are divided into two groups, quarks and leptons. And they're also arranged in 3 generations.
Generations, like families, and they get heavier.
Precisely. Generation 1 is the lightest and contains the particles that make up all the ordinary stable matter around us.
So that's the up quark, the down quark.
Right. And the electron neutrino. Protons are 2 ups, a down quark. Neutrons are 2 downs and an up. Add electrons, and you have atoms.
Okay, so that's us, basically. What about generations 2 and 3?
They're like heavier copies. Generation 2 has the charm quark and strange quark, the muon, like a heavy electron, and the muon neutrino.
And generation 3?
Even heavier. The top quark and bottom quark, the tau lepton, even heavier still, and the tau neutrino.
But these heavier ones, they're unstable.
Very much so. They decay incredibly quickly into lighter particles, mostly first-generation ones. You only really produce them in high-energy situations, like particle collisions or with cosmic rays.
Got it. Okay, let's focus on the quarks first. 6 flavors. Up, down, charm, strange, top, bottom. And they have this color charge thing you mentioned.
Yes, color charge. Again, nothing to do with visual color. It's the charge associated with the strong nuclear force. Comes in 3 types, arbitrarily called red, green, and blue, plus anticolors.
And this leads to color confinement.
Exactly. Quarks are never, ever found on their own in nature. They're always confined inside composite particles called hadrons.
Hadrons, like protons and neutrons.
Protons and neutrons are the most famous examples. They're baryons, made of 3 quarks. There are also mesons, made of 1 quark and 1 antiquark.
So the strong force, mediated by gluons acting on color charge, just won't let them be free.
That's the idea. It gets incredibly strong if you try to pull them apart. Quarks also have electric charge and interact via the weak force too. They feel 3 of the 4 forces, if we count gravity.
Okay. Then the other family of fermions, leptons. 6 of these too.
Electron, muon, tau, those are the charged leptons, and then their partners. The electron neutrino, muon neutrino, and tau neutrino.
And the key difference from quarks is no color charge.
Correct. Leptons do not feel the strong nuclear force at all.
So the electron orbiting a nucleus isn't affected by the strong force holding the nucleus together.
Not directly, no. The charged leptons electron, muon, tau, obviously feel the electromagnetic force because they have electric charge, never one.
And the neutrinos, they're electrically neutral.
Zero electric charge
Ooh.
and no color charge. That means they only interact via the weak force and gravity.
Which makes them incredibly hard to detect. They just pass through everything.
Almost everything. They are like ghosts, fantastically elusive. Billions from the sun are streaming through you right now, unnoticed.
Mind-boggling. Okay, so that's the matter side. 12 fermions, quarks and leptons, in 3 generations. Now, the bosons, the force carriers.
Right, the gauge bosons. These mediate the fundamental interactions described by the Standard Model. They all have spin 1.
And the idea is that forces happen when particles exchange these bosons.
Sort of like passing a ball back and forth, yes. A virtual exchange of these force carrier particles creates what we perceive as a force.
Okay, first up, the photon. Easy one. Electromagnetism.
The photon, symbol gamma,
Yeah.
carries the electromagnetic force. It's responsible for interactions between anything with electric charge.
So light, radio waves, holding atoms together, chemistry, basically everything we interact with visibly.
Pretty much. The theory describing it is quantum electrodynamics, QED. Hugely successful theory. And because the photon is massless, the electromagnetic force has infinite range, although it gets weaker with distance.
Next, the strong force carriers.
The gluons, symbol G. These mediate the strong interaction, binding quarks together inside hadrons.
And there's more than one type.
There are 8 different types of gluons. Unlike photons, which are electrically neutral, gluons themselves carry color charge.
Ah, so gluons can interact with other gluons, not just with quarks.
Exactly. This makes the theory of the strong force, quantum chromodynamics, or QCD, mathematically much more complicated than QED.
And it leads to weird effects like asymptotic freedom and confinement.
That's right. Asymptotic freedom means the strong force gets weaker when quarks are very close together or at very high energies.
Counterintuitive?
It is. But at lower energies, or as you try to pull quarks apart, the force gets incredibly strong. That's confinement, like an unbreakable elastic band. Gluons are also massless, technically, but the force is short range because of confinement.
Okay, fascinating. And the third force in the model, the weak force.
Mediated by the W and Z bosons. There are 3 types. The positively charged W plus 1, the negatively charged W, and the neutral ZZ.
And unlike photons and gluons, these guys are heavy.
Very heavy. That's why the weak force is extremely short range, basically confined within the nucleus.
And the weak force is responsible for radioactive decay.
Primarily, yes. Things like beta decay, where a neutron turns into a proton, involve W bosons. The W bosons are unique because they can change the flavor of a quark or lepton.
Ah, so an up quark can become a down quark or vice versa.
Mediated by a W boson, yes. The Z boson is neutral, and its interactions don't change particle flavor.
And these W and Z, along with the photon, are part of that unified electroweak theory we talked about.
Correct. At very high energies, the electromagnetic and weak forces merge into a single electroweak force. The theory describing this unification was a major triumph.
And the weak force has that weird parity violation thing, too?
Yes, it treats left-handed and right-handed particles differently. Specifically, W bosons only interact with left-handed fermions and right-handed antifermions. Very peculiar asymmetry in nature.
Okay, so that covers the gauge bosons. Photon, EM, gluons strong, W and Z weak. That leaves one more boson.
The Higgs boson, 8-0. The odd one out in some ways.
It's a scalar boson, spin 0. And its job is mass.
Its job is related to why most elementary particles have mass. It's tied to the Higgs field, which is thought to permeate all of space.
So particles get mass by interacting with this field. How does that work?
The analogy often used is wading through treacle or molasses. Imagine space filled with this Higgs field. As particles move through it, they interact with it.
And some interact more strongly than others?
Exactly. Particles that interact strongly with the Higgs field encounter more drag or resistance, and we perceive that resistance as mass. The more interaction, the more mass of the particle.
So things like the top quark interact a lot, and electrons less so.
Precisely. And particles like the photon and gluon don't interact with the Higgs field at all, so they remain massless.
And the Higgs boson itself is like a ripple or an excitation in this field.
That's right. It's the particle associated with the field. And the Higgs boson itself interacts with the field, so it also has mass, quite a substantial mass, actually. And it interacts with itself, too.
Wow. Okay, so quick recap of the forces again. Electromagnetism, photon, acts on electric charge, long range.
Check. Weak force, WZ bosons, acts on flavor-weak isospin, very short range because massive carriers cause a decay, breaks symmetries like parity.
Check. Unified with electromagnetism at high energy.
Strong force, gluons, acts on color charge, binds quarks. Confinement makes it effectively short range despite massless gluons, gets weaker at high energy.
Check. Described by QCD. And don't forget the residual strong force, mediated by mesons like pions, which is what holds protons and neutrons together in the nucleus like a leakage of the main color force.
Right, and the big missing force, gravity, just doesn't fit.
Not within the standard model as a quantum theory, no. We hypothesize a graviton as the force carrier, but we don't have the theory for it. At the particle level, gravity is just incredibly, incredibly weak compared to the others anyway.
Okay, and underneath all this, theoretically, it's a quantum field theory.
Yes, QFT is the mathematical framework, and it's built on fundamental symmetries. We mentioned gauge symmetries, specifically a symmetry group called SU3, SU2, SU1.
Sounds complicated. It is, mathematically. But SU3 corresponds to the strong force, QCD, and SU2, AU1, corresponds to the electroweak force. These symmetries basically dictate the interactions.
And there's a thing called a Lagrangian that describes the whole system.
Yes, the Lagrangian density encodes all the particles, their interactions, and the dynamics of the theory. Write down the right Lagrangian, and in principle, you've defined the standard model.
There's a catch. It doesn't predict everything from first principles. It needs input from experiments.
That's key point. The standard model has a number of free parameters constants whose values are not determined by the theory itself.
How many?
In the middle version, it's 19. These include things like the masses of all the quarks and leptons, the strengths of the forces, coupling constants, and angles related to how quarks mix during weak interactions.
19 numbers we just have to measure and plug in.
Pretty much. And if you add neutrino masses and mixing, which we now know exist, that adds another 7 or 8 parameters, depending on the exact mechanism. So, 26 or 27 numbers taken from experiment.
That feels less than ideal for a fundamental theory.
It's certainly seen as a shortcoming by many physicists. It feels a bit arbitrary, maybe not as elegant as one might hope. We'd prefer a theory that explains why these numbers have the values they do.
But, okay, before we get too critical, let's talk successes, because it has been amazingly successful.
Undeniably. Its biggest triumphs are its predictions. It predicted the existence of the W and Z bosons, the gluon, the charm quark, the top quark, the bottom quark.
And crucially, the Higgs boson, all predicted before they were found.
Exactly. And not just their existence, but their properties, like the masses of the W and Z, were predicted with remarkable accuracy.
And experimental tests of its predictions, things like particle interactions rates, magnetic moments, they match incredibly well.
Down to many decimal places in some cases. The agreement between standard model calculations and experimental results is just stunning. It's arguably the most precisely tested theory in the history of science.
It really is a monumental achievement. It underpins basically all of particle physics today.
It absolutely does. It gives us a fundamental understanding of nearly all non-gravitational phenomena we observe. But, and it's a big but,
it's not the final answer. We keep coming back to the challenges.
We have to, because they point the way forward. We've mentioned gravity, the incompatibility between quantum mechanics and general relativity. That's number one.
These are dark matter and dark energy, making up 95% of the universe's energy budget, and the standard model says nothing about them.
Essentially, yes. No particle in the model has the right properties to be the cold dark matter we observe holding galaxies together. And no mechanism explains dark energy. That's a huge gap in our understanding of cosmology.
The matter-antimatter asymmetry. Why are we here?
The model contains CP violation, which allows for some difference between matter and antimatter. But the amount it predicts is far too small to explain the observed dominance of matter. Something else must be going on.
And that issue with the 19-plus parameters, it feels unsatisfying.
It does feel ad hoc to many. Why these specific masses? Why these coupling strengths? A deeper theory would ideally explain these seemingly arbitrary numbers.
Then there's something called the hierarchy problem. That sounds technical.
It is a bit, but the basic idea is this. The Higgs mass is sensitive to quantum corrections from potentially very high energy physics, maybe near the Planck scale where gravity becomes strong.
Okay.
These corrections would naturally push the Higgs mass, and thus the whole electroweak scale, up to that incredibly high energy scale, unless there's an almost perfect, seemingly miraculous cancellation between different parameters in the underlying theory. an unnatural fine-tuning.
Which physicists don't like. It suggests maybe the standard model isn't the whole story up to the Planck scale. Maybe there's new physics much closer.
Exactly, like supersymmetry or extra dimensions, something that could naturally stabilize the Higgs mass without this extreme fine-tuning. That's a major motivation for looking beyond the standard model.
Are there other theoretical issues, like quantum triviality?
Yeah, that's another subtle one. It suggests that theories with fundamental scalar particles, like the Higgs, might run into mathematical inconsistencies at very high energies, becoming trivial or non-interacting, unless they're part of a larger structure. Another hint that the standard model might be an effective theory, not the ultimate one.
And connecting back to cosmology, it doesn't explain the initial conditions of the universe, like why it's so smooth and flat on large scales.
No, for that you generally need to add something like cosmic inflation, which is an extension beyond the standard model happening right after the Big Bang.
So the picture is incredibly successful within its domain, but with clear boundaries and big unanswered questions pointing beyond it.
That sums it up perfectly. Physicists are exploring all sorts of extensions, grand unified theories, GUTs trying to merge the three forces, supersymmetry, SUSY, string theory, extra dimensions. But so far, no experimental evidence has definitively confirmed any of them.
So it remains the standard model, our best tested description, but definitely incomplete.
It's a true triumph. Fermions, quarks and leptons making up matter, bosons, photon, gluons, WZ carrying the forces, and the Higgs giving mass. Decades of brilliant work, theory, and experiment intertwined.
But it leaves us staring at huge mysteries. Gravity, dark matter, dark energy, why matter dominates, why the parameters are what they are. It's not the theory of everything.
Not by a long shot. And that brings us to the really exciting part, the future. So here's something for you, the listener, to think about.
Yeah.
Given everything the standard model does explain so precisely about the world we can probe, and yet these enormous gaps remain gravity, 95% of the universe's content, the origin of mass values. What do you think the next big breakthrough will look like? Will it be finding that graviton particle, or finally detecting whatever dark matter is made of? Could it be evidence for extra dimensions at the LHC, or something totally unexpected? What new force, what new particle might be hiding just beyond reach, waiting to extend or even replace the standard model?
That's the frontier. What lies beyond the standard model? It's what keeps physicists searching. Keep pondering that one.
Okay, so when you think about performance enhancement, or maybe, physical transformation, what substances usually jump to mind?
Well, for most people, I think the image is pretty clear, right? Elite athletes, maybe huge muscles, something kind of illicit.
Yeah, exactly. And the substance tied to that image, almost always anabolic androgenic steroids.
Right. But the public perception is often, let's say, narrow. It really focuses heavily on sports doping and, well, the scary health risks.
But digging into the information we've got here, that picture gets way, way more complicated.
Yeah.
And honestly, pretty surprising.
Definitely.
So today we're doing a deep dive into these anabolic androgenic steroids, AIS for short.
And we are really unpacking a stack of material for this one. Our main source is a pretty detailed overview from Wikipedia.
And our mission here is simple. Navigate all this info, pull out the key insights, really understand what EIS are, how they work, their uses, effects, their place in society.
And crucially, we're sticking only to what the source material tells us, no bringing in outside stuff. Okay, so let's unpack this. At their absolute core, AIS are basically synthetic versions or modifications of testosterone.
The male hormone.
Right. They're administered from outside the body, exogenous androgens, related to our natural ones.
Okay, but the surprise factor kicks in almost immediately when you look beyond just, bulking up. The source details some really unexpected medical uses.
Oh, absolutely. For instance, historically, they were used to treat breast cancer in women.
Breast cancer with steroids. Wow.
Yeah. It's rare now, the source notes, mainly because of the masculinizing side effects, the virilization.
Still not what you'd expect.
Not at all. And then in lower doses, they're actually part of hormone therapy for postmenopausal women and also for transgender women.
What for?
The material mentions improving energy levels, general well-being, libido, quality of life, even reducing hot flashes.
Huh. Which specific ones?
Testosterone itself is common, but methyltestosterone is also listed for this purpose.
So it's really about, health and quality of life in very specific medical situations, not just muscle gain.
Correct. The source also points to them helping with conditions like Raynaud's phenomenon and peripheral acrocyanosis, circulation issues.
How do they help there?
They can act as potent vasodilators. They help widen blood vessels, improving blood flow.
Interesting. Anything else on the medical front? Maybe more experimental?
Yes, actually. They're being looked at as a potential component in male hormonal contraception.
Male birth control.
Yeah, the goal being something, effective, safe, reliable, and importantly, reversible.
Wow. Okay, so just looking at the medical side described here, from breast cancer to potentially male birth control, it's just so much broader than the stereotype. That's a big takeaway right off the bat.
It really pushes back against that single story, doesn't it?
It really does. And speaking of stereotypes, the source also challenges the idea of who the typical steroid user even is.
Yeah, this is another big one. Maybe the most surprising point here is that, according to the data cited, most people who use steroids are not athletes.
Not athletes. Okay, so who are they then?
Well, based on the U.S. studies mentioned, it's mostly middle-class men, median age around 25, and they're usually non-competitive bodybuilders.
Non-competitive. So not for sports.
Exactly, their main driver.
Yeah.
Cosmetic reasons. They're using them purely for appearance.
That completely shifts the narrative, doesn't it? From competition to body image.
It does, and there's some striking data on younger users, too.
Oh, yeah.
A Blue Cross Blue Shield study is mentioned. It found a 25% jump in steroid use among 12 to 17-year-old boys just between 1999 and 2000.
A 25% jump. That's significant.
And here's the kicker. 20% of those boys explicitly said they use them for appearance, not for sports performance.
That really underscores the body image angle, especially for young men. What about, say, college students?
The source mentions another study looking at that group. It found non-medical use among college students was relatively low, or less than 1%.
Okay, so maybe less common there. But that younger non-athlete group using for looks, that seems like a key demographic identified in the source.
Definitely.
How do these users typically get their information about TALES?
It's interesting. The source notes they tend to research these drugs more than people using other controlled substances.
Okay, so they're looking into it.
Yes, but, and this is important, their main sources of info are often friends, non-medical handbooks, online forums, blogs, fitness magazines.
It sounds like, well, maybe not the most reliable or medically accurate information.
That's the potential issue, exactly. And this probably feeds into how they see things. The source says users are often pretty unhappy with how TALES are portrayed in the media and by politicians often as, just deadly poisons.
And the relationship with doctors, how does that play out?
The studies cited paint a pretty clear picture of distrust, significant distrust.
Really?
Yeah, one study found 56% didn't tell their doctor they were using. Another found that while, 66% were willing to get medical supervision, 58% specifically didn't trust their doctors.
That's a high level of distrust.
It is. And get this, 92% felt the medical community just lacked knowledge about non-medical use. And 99%, almost everyone, felt the public view of the side effects was exaggerated.
Wow. That's a huge disconnect. A group using substances with known risks, but fundamentally distrusting the people who could help manage those risks.
Yeah. And the source also mentions some potential psychological links. Long-term users were apparently more likely to show symptoms of muscle dysmorphia.
Like body image issues focused on muscularity.
Exactly. And also a stronger endorsement of sort of conventional male roles. The belief that you can use them safely in moderation is also noted as common among users.
So the user profile emerging from this source is, well, it's complex. Not just athletes, driven by appearance, using maybe unreliable info sources, and deeply distrustful of the medical establishment. That's a really crucial context.
Definitely. Okay, maybe we should shift gears slightly and get into the science. Like, how do these things actually work?
Yeah, let's do it. This is where it gets interesting, down at the cellular level. So unlike a lot of hormones, AAS are fat-soluble. What does that mean?
It means they can slip right through the outer membrane of a cell pretty easily. They don't need a special doorway.
Okay, they're inside the cell, then what?
Once inside, they're looking for their target, the androgen receptor, the AR. It's usually floating around in the cell's main body, the cytoplasm.
So the steroid finds the receptor.
It binds to it, like a key in a lock. And this new complex, the steroid plus the receptor, then travels into the cell's control center, the nucleus.
And inside the nucleus, that's where the action happens, influencing genes.
Precisely. This complex can directly interact with the cell's DNA. It can change gene expression, basically telling the cell to make more of certain proteins, or it can activate other signaling pathways that relay messages within the cell.
And the end result of all that signaling and gene changing is?
Well, the main outcomes we associate with AOS: increased protein synthesis, that's the building block for tissues, enhanced muscle growth, obviously, and also reduced muscle breakdown, or catabolism.
So building more, breaking down less.
Right. And they also influence what cells become. They kind of push cells towards differentiating into muscle cells rather than fat-storing cells.
The source mentioned something about certain body parts responding more.
Yeah, it seems the upper body, think chest, neck, shoulders, upper arms, might be more susceptible. The thinking is there are simply more of these androgen receptors, more ARs, in the muscle cells in those areas.
And you can see differences.
Apparently, yeah. Significant differences in muscle fiber size have been noted in specific muscles, like the quads versus the traps, in people who've used them long-term.
And the strength gains, can they be substantial?
The source notes a pretty wide range, actually. Improvements from maybe 5% up to 20% of baseline strength. Depends on the drug, the dose, how long you use it. Bench press is often highlighted as showing big improvements.
Right. There's that study you mentioned earlier with novice athletes.
Yes, that was a key one mentioned. It showed guys just starting strength training who took 600 milligrams of testosterone and anthate a week. They gained significantly more strength than the guys just training without the drug.
Okay, that makes sense. Drug plus training beats training alone.
But here's the really striking part. That same dose, 600 milligrams a week, was enough to significantly increase lean muscle mass compared to a placebo, even in the subjects who didn't exercise at all.
Wait, really? They gained muscle without working out, just from the drug?
According to that study cited, yes. It's a powerful illustration of the drug's direct anabolic effect on muscle tissue separate from the training stimulus.
It was a dose-dependent, like more drug equals more muscle.
Yes, the source states the anabolic effects in that study were highly dose-dependent.
Okay, now let's tackle this whole idea of anabolic versus androgenic. Muscle building versus masculinizing. The name itself, anabolic steroid, kind of implies you can separate those two things.
Yeah, that concept goes way back to the early days of discovery. It was the hope, really, that chemists could tweak the molecules to get the muscle growth without the unwanted masculinizing effects.
And that led to things like that index.
Right, the myotrophic androgenic index, but the source is clear. This was based on, frankly, outdated rat studies comparing muscle growth in one specific muscle versus changes in reproductive tissues like the prostate. It calls the model simple and outdated.
So if they all basically hit the same receptor, the AR, why do different steroids seem to have different profiles? Why does one seem more anabolic and another more androgenic if the separation idea is flawed?
Okay, this is where the pharmacology gets really cool. And the source points to intracellular metabolism as the main, most supported explanation.
Intracellular metabolism, meaning what happens inside the cell.
Exactly. Think of it this way. The steroid gets into the cell, right?
Yeah.
But before it necessarily gets to the nucleus and binds the AR, enzymes within that cell can chemically change it, modify it.
Enzymes.
Yeah.
Like little biological machines doing chemistry.
Perfect analogy. So one really important enzyme is called 5-reductase. In certain tissues, key ones like skin, scalp, prostate, seminal vesicles, this enzyme grabs testosterone and converts it into dihydrotestosterone, or DHT.
Okay. And DHT is?
DHT is a much more potent activator of the androgen receptor than testosterone itself. Significantly more powerful.
Okay, so testosterone gets a power-up in those tissues.
Right. But here's the crucial part. That 5-reductase enzyme, it's not very active in skeletal muscle or bone.
So testosterone gets a big potency boost in androgenic tissues like the prostate and scalp, but not in muscle.
Precisely. So relative to its effect in muscle, testosterone's effects in those other tissues seem much stronger. It appears more androgenic.
Okay, that makes sense for testosterone. What about other steroids?
Well, many other AS, especially those derived from nandrolone, react differently with that same 5-reductase enzyme. Instead of being turned into something more potent, they get converted into less active forms in those androgenic tissues.
They get weakened.
Essentially, yeah. Or they might be designed so they can't be 5-reduced at all, so they don't get that androgenic potency boost, or they even get weakened while still activating the AR in muscle. That's a major reason why some AIs have a better apparent anabolic to androgenic ratio.
Got it. So it's not really different actions at the receptor. It's about how the drug is chemically altered by the cell in different locations before it even gets there.
That's the core idea, yes. The source really emphasizes this metabolic conversion or lack thereof as a key factor determining that ratio and the risk of those classic androgenic side effects: acne, male pattern baldness, prostate enlargement.
What about estrogen? Some steroids cause estrogen-like effects, right? Like gynecomastia.
Yes, another enzyme called aromatase comes into play here. It can convert testosterone into estradiol, which is the main estrogen. Other abeli can also be aromatized into their own estrogenic versions.
Does this happen all of them?
No. Some types, like those derived from DHT, cannot be aromatized at all. Others, like nandrolone derivatives, can be, but generally less readily than testosterone.
And the 17 alkylated oral ones we talked about.
They can be aromatized too, often less than testosterone, but the source mentions that the resulting estrogens can sometimes be more potent, biologically active.
And the main consequence of this aromatization is?
Gynecomastia, the development of breast tissue in males, is the big one. Steroids that aromatize easily, like testosterone or methyltestosterone, carry a higher risk. Those that can't be aromatized, like DHT derivatives or some newer compounds, carry basically zero risk of causing gynecomastia directly.
Does estrogen conversion affect anything else?
Yeah, it also increases how much the drug suppresses your natural testosterone production, its antigonadotropic effect.
Okay, there was one more enzyme mentioned, 3-AHSD.
Right. This enzyme is important because it can inactivate certain androgens, particularly DHT, in skeletal muscle.
So it turns them off in the muscle itself.
Yeah. So steroids that are resistant to being inactivated by 3-HSD in muscle might theoretically be better muscle builders. The source gives examples like DHT itself, which gets inactivated quickly in muscle and so isn't very anabolic, whereas drugs like stanozolol or oxandrolone are poor substrates for this enzyme and are known as potent anabolics.
Although the source adds a little note about potential long-term heart risks with those resistant ones.
It does mention that possibility, yes.
Okay, so zooming out on the pharmacology, the big takeaway seems to be they all hit the same main receptor, the AR, but there are different effects and side effect profiles, largely down to how enzymes inside the cells and different tissues chew them up, activate them, or inactivate them. It's all about this intracellular metabolism.
Exactly. That's the most strongly supported explanation presented in the source material. The other ideas mention, like maybe the AR works slightly differently with different drugs, or signaling happening outside the nucleus seem to have less evidence, especially when you look at clinical examples.
Like the one about women with non-functional ARs.
Yeah, the source mentions women with complete androgen insensitivity syndrome. Their nuclear AR doesn't work, but they have normal testosterone levels and theoretically normal signaling through any membrane ARs. Yet they develop as completely female, suggesting the nuclear AR is really the main or maybe the only driver of both masculinization and muscle-building effects mediated by androgens.
Fascinating stuff. Okay, so beyond how they work inside the cell, what other factors influence their overall effects in the body?
A really big one is their antigonadotropic effect. We touched on this.
Meaning they shut down natural hormone production.
Right. When you introduce these external androgens, your body senses high levels and tells the gonads, the testes in men, hey, we've got enough, stop making testosterone. This suppression gets stronger with higher doses.
So the drug you're taking basically replaces your body's own testosterone.
Effectively, yes. It takes over the signaling at the androgen receptor throughout your system.
And you mentioned some also act like progesterone?
Yes, many of the 19 nortestosterone derivatives, nandrolone and trenbolone, are key examples, are also potent progestogens. They activate the progesterone receptor, or PR.
And does activating the PR do anything similar?
It does. PR activation is also antigonadotropic, meaning it also suppresses natural testosterone production. So if you have a drug like nandrolone that hits both the AR and the PR, you can get a really profound suppression of natural testosterone, potentially down into the castrate range.
Which would enhance the drug's relative effect.
Yes, and it also contributes to their effectiveness as potential male contraceptives because strong suppression is needed to stop sperm production.
Okay, it's really a web of interacting hormonal effects. Let's talk about how people actually, get these into their bodies. The routes of administration.
The source lists the common ones. You've got oral pills, injectable steroids, creams or gels you rub on the topical and skin patches.
Oral seems like the easiest, right? Just swallow a pill.
It's definitely the most convenient. But there's a catch with testosterone itself. If you just swallow it, the liver breaks most of it down before it can get into your system and do much.
So they modify it.
Usually, yes. To make steroids orally active, they often get chemically modified, most commonly through something called 17-alkylation. Methyltestosterone is the classic example. That modification helps it survive the first pass through the liver.
But that's the modification with the downside we discussed earlier.
Yeah.
The liver risk.
Exactly. That 17-alkylation, while making it orally effective, is also what gives these specific steroids a significant potential for liver toxicity or hepatotoxicity.
Is it a guaranteed problem?
No, the source says it's primarily, maybe even exclusively, linked to these 17-alkylated types, and even then it's considered uncommon and usually associated with prolonged use. But the risk is definitely there with that specific structure.
Are there any orals without that specific modification and risk?
The source mentions a few that aren't 17-alkylated but are still orally active because they resist liver breakdown in other ways. Mestrolone is one, though it's noted as weak. And some newer experimental ones like dimethandrolone and 11-MNT are mentioned as having minimal liver toxicity risk.
Okay. Injectables seem to be the most common method for non-medical users, according to the source.
Yes, injection is definitely the most frequent route in non-medical settings. A key thing here is the duration of action varies wildly.
How so?
It depends on the ester attached to the steroid molecule. Think of it like a chemical tail that controls how quickly the drug is released into the bloodstream from the injection site.
Give me some examples.
Okay, so testosterone propion might last only 3-4 days. Testosterone enanthate or cypionate, maybe 2 to 4 weeks. And then you have things like testosterone undecanoate in an oil solution that can last up to 100 days from a single shot.
Wow, huge difference. And nandrolone esters vary too.
Yep, phenylpropion lasts about 10 days, while decanoate lasts 3 to 4 weeks.
Okay, what about the topicals, creams, gels, patches?
These deliver the drug through the skin. They can provide a nice, steady dose level. But absorption can be pretty inefficient, maybe only 10% for creams and gels, and it can vary a lot between individuals.
Practical issues too.
Yeah, like if you sweat a lot or shower frequently, you might wash it off.
And the risk of transferring it to others.
That's a really significant concern mentioned with topicals. The steroid can easily rub off onto clothing, furniture, or directly onto intimate partners or children through skin contact.
And that's a problem because
Women, and especially children, are much more sensitive to the effects of androgens. Even a small amount transferred unintentionally can cause significant masculinization or other health problems in them. It's a serious risk.
Right. The source also briefly mentions designer steroids. What are those?
These are basically AS that were never approved for medical use, never marketed by pharmaceutical companies, but they're synthesized, often illicitly, and distributed on the black market.
Any examples given?
Yeah, the source lists things like 1-testosterone methasterone, sometimes called superdrol, trenbolone enanthate, and tetrahydrogestrinone, or THG, which was famous from the Belso scandal.
Okay, that covers how they're used. Now let's confront the other side of the coin, the side effects. The source provides a really extensive list, but emphasizes many are dose-dependent.
That's a key point. Higher doses, longer use generally mean higher risk and severity. But let's try to group some of the main potential effects mentioned.
Okay, starting with skin issues. Dermatological.
Right. Things like oily skin, acne vulgaris, sometimes quite severe seborrhea. Stretch marks can happen from rapid muscle growth, hirsutism, which is excessive body hair growth, and paradoxically, androgenic alopecia, or male pattern baldness in those genetically predisposed. Fluid retention is also common.
What about effects on reproductive systems and hormones? Endocrine effects.
Changes in libido could go up or down. Reversible infertility is a big one. And hypogonadism, which is the suppression of the body's own natural testosterone production that we talked about.
Okay, and then there are effects specific to males.
Yes. Things like spontaneous erections, nocturnal emissions, priapism, that's a prolonged painful erection. Erectile dysfunction can also occur. Gynecomastia, the breast tissue development, especially with those aromatizable steroids. Testicular atrophy, the testes shrinking because they stop producing testosterone in sperm, low sperm count. And potential prostate issues like benign prostatic hyperplasia, enlargement, and an increased risk of prostate cancer, though that's still debated.
And for females, the effects are often grouped under masculinization or virilization.
Correct. And the source stresses that many of these can be irreversible even after stopping the drug. Voice deepening is a classic, often permanent change. Hirsutism, male pattern hair growth on the face and body. menstrual disturbances like irregular periods or stopping altogether, clitoral enlargement or clitoromegaly, atrophy of the breasts and uterus, and importantly, teratogenicity, meaning they can cause birth defects, specifically masculinization of female fetuses if used during pregnancy.
What about effects specifically in children or adolescents?
A major concern is premature epiphyseal closure. The growth plates at the ends of bones fuse too early. This stops bone growth and can result in permanently short stature. In boys, it can cause precocious puberty, developing secondary sexual characteristics too early. In girls, it can cause delayed puberty or contrasexual puberty, meaning they develop male characteristics.
Okay, moving on to psychiatric and neurological effects. The list in the source seems quite long here, too.
It is. It covers a wide range. Mood swings, irritability, aggression, sometimes termed roid rage, though that's maybe simplistic, violent behavior, impulsivity, hypomania, or even full-blown mania, euphoria, but also the opposite. Depression, anxiety, dysphoria, suicidality is mentioned. In severe cases, delusions and psychosis.
Is dependence or withdrawal an issue?
Yes, the source mentions withdrawal symptoms upon stopping and the potential for dependence. It also lists potential long-term issues like neurotoxicity and cognitive impairment, though evidence might be less robust there.
There were also links to personality profiles.
Yeah, studies cited found associations between AS use and higher scores on scales for things like borderline, antisocial, paranoid, schizotypal, histrionic, passive-aggressive, and narcissistic personality traits compared to non-users. Also associations with bipolar dysfunction, substance dependency, and conduct disorder.
And the link with depression specifically was noted as complex.
Right. The source says it's inconclusive. AS might relieve depression in some, cause it in others, and stopping them can definitely trigger depression. It basically calls for more research.
There's also note about diagnosis.
Yes, that if someone doesn't disclose their AS use, a doctor might misdiagnose a personality disorder because technically the symptoms shouldn't be better explained by the direct effects of a substance.
Interesting point. Okay, physical effects beyond hormones and the brain, musculoskeletal.
Besides the intended muscle hypertrophy, risks include muscle strains, tendon ruptures, because tendons might not strengthen as fast as muscles, and rhabdomyolysis, which is a serious condition where muscle tissue breaks down rapidly, releasing harmful substances into the blood.
The cardiovascular side effects seem particularly concerning based on the source.
They are definitely a major area of concern. The list includes dyslipidemia, bad cholesterol, LDL goes up, good cholesterol, HDL goes down, atherosclerosis, the hardening of arteries, elevated hematocrit, meaning more red blood cells, which can thicken the blood and increase clot risk, leading to thrombosis, embolism, stroke, hypertension, or high blood pressure, especially if someone already has it.
Heart muscle changes too.
Yes. Left ventricular hypertrophy, the main pumping chamber gets bigger and thicker. Cardiomyopathy, which is disease of the heart muscle. Myocardial hypertrophy in general. Arrhythmias or irregular heartbeats. And ultimately, increased risk of myocardial infarction, heart attack, stroke, and even sudden cardiac death.
The source does mention some of these changes are seen in drug-free athletes too, but ANAs might accelerate them.
Yes, it makes that point, though it also notes that the specific link between some steroid-induced heart changes and decreased heart function has been disputed in some research.
Okay, what about the liver? Hepatic effects. We touched on this with the oral steroids.
Right, primarily linked to those 17 alkylated orals. Effects can range from elevated liver enzymes showing stress to actual hepatotoxicity, jaundice, cholestasis, bile flow blockage, fatty liver disease. In rare, usually prolonged high-dose cases, liver tumors, both benign adenomas and malignant carcinomas, and pileocyst hepatis, a condition with blood-filled cysts in the liver.
So, again, strongly tied to that specific chemical structure for the most part.
Yes, the source emphasizes that link. Non-17 alkylated steroids are rarely associated with liver issues, especially at replacement doses. It does mention some metabolites, D-ring glucuronides of testosterone DHT, have been found to be cholestatic, though.
And the kidneys. Renal effects.
Also potentially serious. Renal hypertrophy, kidney enlargement, general nephropathy or kidney damage, acute renal failure, sometimes as a consequence of that rhabdomyolysis we mentioned, and a specific condition called focal segmental glomerulosclerosis, or FSGS.
FSGS, what's that?
It's a type of scarring within the filtering units of the kidneys. It can lead to kidney failure. The source highlights a study that found FSGS in 9 out of 10 bodybuilders who use steroids.
9 out of 10, that's incredibly high.
It is. The study noted the severity was similar to that seen in morbid obesity, but in some cases appeared even more severe. That's a very specific and concerning finding presented. Risk of renal cell carcinoma is also mentioned.
Okay. Any other side effects listed?
Just briefly, glucose intolerance and insulin resistance, like prediabetes and potential immune system dysfunction.
Wow. Okay, so the list is extensive. It impacts nearly every system in the body. And the key takeaways on side effects seem to be dose dependency, the specific risks tied to chemical structure like the 17-alkylation for liver toxicity, and the fact that some effects like the voice deepening in women or that FSGS kidney damage can be permanent. It's a really complex risk profile.
Absolutely. Maybe it's helpful now to step back and look at the history. Where did these things even come from?
The source traces roots way back. Mentions ancient practices like using cow urine in India or hormone extraction from urine in China centuries ago. More recognizably, medical use of testicle extracts started in the late 19th century.
But the modern story really gets going in the 1930s. Isolation and synthesis.
Right. 1931, androstenone purified from urine. 1934, it's synthesized.
Then 1935 was the big year, the race to isolate the more potent hormone directly from testes.
Testosterone.
Exactly. 3 different groups were closing in. David, Dingemans, Freud, and Lacour apparently were first to identify and name it testosterone in May 35.
And then synthesis followed quickly.
Very quickly. Buchanan and Hanisch published their synthesis from cholesterol in August, and almost simultaneously, Rijeka and Wettstein announced they had filed a patent application for their synthesis method.
And Buchanan and Rijeka ended up sharing the Nobel Prize for Chemistry in 1939 for this work.
Though Buchanan initially had to decline it because of the Nazi regime's policies at the time, he accepted it later.
When did they start trying these out on people?
Remarkably early. The source says human trials began as early as 1937, using oral methyltestosterone and injectable testosterone propionate.
Then World War II, there are rumors and reports.
Yeah, unproven rumors about German soldiers using them for aggression or stamina. The source does state Hitler was reportedly injected with testosterone derivatives. More grimly, they were used in Nazi experiments on concentration camp inmates.
But also used by the Allies after the war.
Yes, for treating severely malnourished, liberated prisoners and other victims.
After the war, the focus shifted, didn't it? Towards the muscle-building side.
It did, particularly in the 1940s and 50s. The Soviet Union and Eastern Bloc countries reportedly started using them systematically in their sports programs, especially weightlifting.
Which triggered a reaction in the West.
Specifically in the U.S., the source mentions the U.S. Olympic team physician Dr. John Ziegler learned about the Soviet use and worked with chemists to develop an AS with hopefully fewer androgenic side effects.
And that led to?
Metandiano, better known by the brand name Dianabol.
Was it approved medically?
Yes, in the U.S. in 1958, indications were for things like treating burn victims and the elderly, but almost immediately it was adopted off-label by bodybuilders and weightlifters.
Did Ziegler remain positive about it?
No, the source notes he later became concerned, finding that even at the small doses he recommended, users developed side effects like enlarged prostates and testicular atrophy. He eventually turned against non-medical use.
So that history really shows the tension between the intended medical uses and the drive for performance enhancement or physique change.
Absolutely. And this growing use in sports eventually led to bans.
Right. The IOC banned ES in 1976.
And later introduced more effective out-of-competition testing. Now, the World Anti-Doping Agency, WDA, maintains the list, and it includes basically all anabolic agents. They're banned by essentially all major sports bodies mentioned: MLB, NFL, Olympics, FIFA, you name it.
Okay. Let's shift slightly and talk about the language, how we even talk about these substances. The source brings up a debate around the terminology itself.
Yeah, this is interesting. The term anabolic steroid itself dates back to the mid-1940s. It came directly from that hope we discussed, the idea you could dissociate the anabolic muscle-building effects from the androgenic masculinizing ones.
And the first one.
Norhandrolone, synthesized in 53, studied in 55, introduced in 56. It showed a marked separation in those old animal bioassays and was described as the first anabolic steroid.
And that term just stuck.
It became the preferred term, yeah. And now it's applied really broadly to pretty much any AR agonist that has anabolic effects, even natural testosterone itself, regardless of how androgenic it actually is.
Even though, as the source points out, no AS is purely anabolic.
Right. They all retain some androgenicity. And flip side, all androgens are inherently anabolic. It's part of what they do.
So anabolic steroid can be kind of misleading.
That's the argument, which led to the more recent term anabolic androgenic steroid, AAS. It explicitly acknowledges both actions are present and suggests the old distinction is may be questionable.
The source discusses a specific critique of this terminology from a researcher named David Handelsman.
Yes. And we should be clear, we're just reporting his viewpoint as presented in the source. He argues pretty forcefully that terms like anabolic steroid and even AAS are essentially obsolete, meaningless, and create a false distinction from simply calling them androgens.
What's his reasoning?
His points, as summarized, are: 1, the pharmaceutical industry's quest to separate the effects failed by the 1970s. 2, it failed because there's really only one main androgen receptor mediating these effects. 3, the differences we do see between drugs are mostly due to that intracellular metabolism we talked about, especially Phi reduction, not fundamentally different actions.
So his conclusion is,
Just call them all androgens. He finds AAS kind of oxymoronic, since androgenic effects include anabolic effects. And he also notes the potential for confusion with corticosteroids, which are totally different hormones.
so it's a perspective arguing for terminological simplicity based on the underlying biology. Interesting that even the name is debated.
Oh.
Okay, finally, let's look at AKS in society, starting with their legal status, which the source says varies a lot.
Hugely. Let's start with the U.S. There, AAS are Schedule III controlled substances under federal law.
What does Schedule III mean in practice?
It means possession without a valid prescription is a federal crime. The source mentions up to 1 year in prison for a first offense of simple possession. Manufacturing, distributing, or possessing with intent to distribute carries much stiffer penalties, up to 10 years for a first offense.
When did this happen?
The Anabolic Steroids Control Act of 1990 is what first put them on the schedule. Then the 2004 update added many pro-hormones to the list as well.
But doctors can still prescribe them legally.
Yes, they remain prescription medications. However, the source notes that even for potentially legitimate uses like injury recovery, their prescription is considered quite taboo among many mainstream sports medicine doctors and endocrinologists. There's a reluctance.
Okay. How does Canada compare?
In Canada, there's Schedule IV substances under their Controlled Drugs and Substances Act. It's illegal to obtain or sell them without a prescription. But, and this is a key difference from the U.S., simple possession itself is not punishable.
Really? So having them isn't a crime, but buying or selling is?
Exactly. Buying or selling carries penalties up to 18 months imprisonment. Importing or exporting has similar penalties.
And there was that Canadian study showing significant student use back in the 90s.
Yes, the 1993 study mentioned estimated nearly 83,000 Canadian students aged 11 to 18 had used them, highlighting it wasn't just a U.S. issue.
What about the UK?
In the UK, they're Class C drugs, under Schedule IV, Part 2 of the Misuse of Drugs Regulations. You generally need a special license from the Home Office to import or export them. Unless it's clearly a medicinal product you're bringing in for your own personal administration. In that case, possession itself isn't an offense.
So similarly to Canada, in that personal possession of a medicinal product isn't criminalized.
Broadly, yes, though the specifics of import-export differ.
Are there places where they're easier to get?
The source explicitly states they are readily available without a prescription in some countries, naming Mexico and Thailand as examples.
And lists others where they are illegal without prescription.
Yes, mentioning Australia, Argentina, Brazil, and Portugal in that category, so a real patchwork of laws globally.
The source also touches on law enforcement concerns, beyond just users, concerns about officers themselves using.
Yeah, particularly in the U.S. Federal law enforcement agencies have reportedly expressed concern about police officer use. The DEA was quoted considering it a big problem, and an FBI bulletin apparently called it a serious problem that needed greater awareness within departments.
And in the UK, any similar concerns mentioned?
The source mentions a belief or concern that some UK officers might use criminal contacts to obtain steroids, which is seen as a potential corruption risk factor.
Okay. And finally, a quick note on the economics mentioned. Where do these illicit steroids come from?
Well, some are diverted from legitimate pharmaceutical production, but in countries with stricter laws, a lot are produced in clandestine underground laboratories.
Using raw materials from?
Often using raw steroid powders imported, frequently from countries where controls are looser. The source says the vast majority obtained illegally on the black market come from these underground labs or through smuggling.
And organized crime is involved.
As with many profitable black markets involving international smuggling, yes, the source indicates organized crime plays a role.
Okay, wow. We have covered an enormous amount of ground here, all based on this source material.
We really have. We started with that common stereotype AAS, just for athletes, just for doping, and immediately saw it was much more complex.
Yeah, the surprising medical uses really stood out.
Then we got into the nitty-gritty of the pharmacology, how they work, and importantly, how that intracellular metabolism, those enzymes, explain why different steroids have different effects, rather than some simple anabolic androgenic switch.
And the user profile, mostly non-athletes, focused on cosmetics, relying on dubious info, distrusting doctors. That was eye-opening.
Definitely. Then the history, the journey from scientific discovery to sports bans, even the debate over what we should call these things.
Right, the terminology debate. And finally, navigating the complex web of legal statuses around the world, the societal impacts, the black market economics.
It really paints a picture that's far more nuanced and, frankly, more multifaceted than just performance-enhancing drugs for athletes.
Absolutely. The source material clearly shows that.
So maybe the thought to leave everyone with is this. Given this complex pharmacology we've unpacked, the really wide range of effects, some beneficial in specific contexts, many potentially harmful, and even permanent, and the finding that most users aren't elite athletes, but often people dealing with cosmetic goals or body image issues, how might our societal understanding, and maybe even our approach to anabolic androgenic steroids need to evolve?
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. This is where we take the sources you share and, well, we unpack them together.
That's right.
Today, we're diving deep into some really rich material you sent over, all focused on anthropology, which is, I mean, it's a huge field, right?
Absolutely. Sprawling, really.
So our mission today is to try and get to grips with what anthropology actually is, where did it come from, what are its main parts, and, why does studying humanity this way matter so much?
It's going to be interesting. We'll be touching on everything from human behavior and biology to cultures, societies, language.
Across time and space, no less.
Exactly. And what's really fascinating, I think, is just how broad it is. The source material shows it pulling from so many different places.
Yeah.
We're going to try and connect some dots for you that might seem pretty far apart at first glance.
Okay, sounds good. Let's start right at the top then. According to the source, what is anthropology at its heart? What's the core idea?
Well, at its most basic level, it's defined as the scientific study of humanity. Simple enough, right?
Seems straightforward.
But the complexity comes in because it's concerned with pretty much everything human. Behavior, biology, cultures, societies, language.
Okay.
And crucially, it looks at these things both now, in the present, and in the past, including, archaic humans. Way back.
So it's not just like digging up ancient ruins or only studying remote tribes today.
No, not at all. It aims to be much more holistic than that. That idea of holism, looking at the whole picture, is really key here.
Right.
And the source material breaks this down into main components, or branches, you could call them, especially how it's often set up in North America and Asia.
And those are, what are the main branches?
So you've got sociocultural, then linguistic, then biological, or sometimes called physical anthropology, and finally, archaeology.
Okay, can you tell us a little bit about each one? How do they fit together?
Sure. Sociocultural anthropology, well, it kind of combines two older strands. Social anthropology, which often focuses on patterns of behavior like social structures, kinship, politics.
How people organize themselves.
Exactly. And cultural anthropology, which leans more towards understanding cultural meaning, beliefs, values, symbols, how people make sense of their world. They often merged now, but that's the basic idea.
Makes sense. And linguistic.
Linguistic anthropology looks at language, but not just grammar and vocabulary. It explores how language shapes and is shaped by social life, how it influences thought, culture, power dynamics. Really fascinating stuff.
Yeah, definitely. Biological or physical?
That's about us as biological organisms. So human evolution, our relationship to other primates, human variation, genetics, health, adaptation to environments.
The physical side of being human.
Precisely. And then archaeology.
That's the digging part, right? Finding old stuff.
Well, yes, often involves digging. But it's the study of past human activity through the physical evidence people left behind. Tools, buildings, trash pits, art. anything material.
Okay.
The source points out that in North America and Asia, it's usually seen as a core part of anthropology.
Hmm.
Sometimes it's even called the anthropology of the past.
But you mentioned there's a difference depending on where you are.
Yes, and this is interesting. The source notes that in Europe, archaeology is often treated as a completely separate discipline.
Really?
Yeah. Or sometimes it's grouped more with history or paleontology rather than being under the main anthropology umbrella. It just shows how academic fields can develop differently in different places.
That's fascinating, how the same subject gets sliced up differently.
Yeah.
So, okay, this massive field, where did it actually begin? Let's trace the history a bit, based on the source.
Well, the word itself tells us something. It comes from Greek, anthropos, meaning human.
And logos, study.
Right, the study of humans. The source mentions the word popping up in English way back in 1593, talking about history. But the meaning we use today, that really starts taking shape in Renaissance Germany. Thinkers like Hunt and Kasman.
Renaissance Germany. Wow, that feels quite early for what we think of as modern anthropology.
It does, doesn't it? But by the 17th century, you had scholars like the Bartholins defining it. They called it the science that treats of man. And they divided it into anatomy, studying the body, and psychology, studying the soul. Very different from the four fields we just talked about.
Definitely. So what happened in the 19th century, that seems to be when things really started shifting towards the anthropology we recognize now.
The 19th century was absolutely crucial. You start seeing the term used more for the natural history of humans, paleontology even.
Okay.
And importantly, academic chairs, like university positions specifically for anthropology, start getting created. France had one in 1850.
Ah, so it's becoming institutionalized.
Exactly. And you get the first organizations forming. Initially, some were quite focused on ideas about human races, which obviously became very problematic.
Right.
But interestingly, the source points out that some key early societies, like the American Ethnological Society or the Ethnological Society of London, were explicitly liberal for their time, anti-slavery, pro-human rights. They were already developing comparative methods.
And then Darwin published On the Origin of Species. The source calls that an epiphany. Why was it so huge for anthropology?
Yeah, Darwin. His ideas about evolution through natural selection provided this incredibly powerful framework. Many thinkers saw it as a way to understand not just biological life, but also the development and, the variation in human societies and cultures over time.
So it gave them a potential mechanism to explain diversity and change.
Precisely. It really spurred efforts to apply evolutionary thinking to human studies, for better or worse in some cases, but it was definitely a catalyst.
And that led to more formal anthropological societies.
Yes. You see the founding of groups like the Société d'Anthropologie de Paris in 1859. Paul Broca was key there, defining anthropology as the study of the human group, considered as a whole, which sounds much more like that holistic approach we talked about.
Getting closer.
Yeah, and you also had figures like Theodor Waitz in Germany pushing for a comparative empirical approach based on evidence. And importantly, he stressed the fundamental unity of the human species, despite all the variation.
And this momentum just kept building.
It really did. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw this boom in societies, journals, departments all over the world, leading to things like the American Anthropological Association forming in 1902.
Now, the source does bring up a critical point here, a debate about the field's origins. It mentions the view that it served as a colonial science.
Yes, it does note that. The source makes it clear that the field's historical connections with colonialism and state power are a really significant area of debate and critical self-reflection within anthropology itself. It's something the discipline continues to grapple with.
Okay. So moving into the 20th century and beyond, the field just exploded, right? What does modern anthropology look like now?
Exploding is a good word for it. Massive expansion. Anthropology departments became common in universities everywhere. And it diversified into, dozens and dozens of subfields.
Wow.
And another key development was the rise of practical or applied anthropology, using anthropological knowledge, those methods we talked about, to actually solve specific real-world problems.
Like what kind of problem?
Well, the source gives a really compelling example. A forensic anthropologist using their expertise in human bones, osteology, to help identify victims in criminal investigations or mass disasters.
So it's not just purely academic theory. It has direct applications.
Increasingly so, yes. And it's become much more globalized, too. You have international organizations now like the WCAA, the AAA in the US, IESA in Europe, trying to connect researchers worldwide.
The source also mentions some key distinctions that emerged especially after big figures like Franz Boas in the US and Malinowski in Britain,
Right. Bose and Malinowski were hugely influential. You had, for a time, a noticeable difference between British social anthropology and U.S. cultural anthropology.
which we mentioned earlier, they sort of merged into sociocultural.
Yeah, they've converged a lot over time into what we usually just call sociocultural now. But the important thing the source highlights is what set anthropology apart, and still does in many
And
ways.
that is,
Things like a strong emphasis on cross-cultural comparison, looking at similarities and differences across societies, and, maybe most distinctively, a commitment to long-term, in-depth fieldwork. Context is everything.
right, that immersion.
Exactly, and specifically, participant observation. That method where the researcher lives within the community they're studying, participating in daily life while systematically observing and recording.
That's the classic image of an anthropologist, isn't it? No book in hand, living somewhere unfamiliar.
It is a classic image, yeah. And that U.S. structure, the source mentions it again, it's still often framed around those four fields.
Biological, physical, sociocultural, archaeological, and linguistic.
Correct. The source reiterates that as a common way to organize things, especially in the U.S., and it stresses that while these fields often overlap and inform each other, they do tend to ask different questions and use different methods.
So putting it all together, how does the source describe the field today? What's its overall nature?
It's painted as this really unique global discipline. It manages to combine insights and approaches from the humanities, the social sciences, and the natural sciences, which is quite unusual.
Yeah, most fields stay in their lane.
Right. Anthropology tries to bridge them. It builds on what we learn about human origins, evolution, biology, but integrates that with our understanding of social relationships, cultural meanings, institutions, history.
Trying to see the whole human story.
Exactly. The source includes a great quote from Clifford Geertz. He called anthropology perhaps the last of the great 19th century conglomerate disciplines, still for the most part organizationally intact.
A conglomerate discipline. I like that.
He also called it a diffuse assemblage, sort of held together by academic structures, and maybe, he suggests, a bit of a romantic image of comprehensive scholarship.
That really captures that sprawling, slightly unwieldy, but fascinating nature of it. The source also mentions a big shift in thinking within the field itself, about knowledge.
Yes, an important epistemological shift, particularly in sociocultural anthropology, happened between the 1970s and 1990s.
Epistemological, meaning
Meaning how we think about knowledge itself, what counts as knowledge, how we produce it, how objective it can be. Sociocultural anthropology moved away from a more strictly positivist view, the idea that knowledge is just out there, objective, waiting to be discovered.
Good.
It became more reflexive, focusing on the role of the researcher, power dynamics, how knowledge is constructed in specific contexts. Meanwhile, the source notes archaeology and biological anthropology tended to remain more aligned with positivist approaches.
Interesting divergence there. So pulling back, again, what are the main takeaways, the basic trends across the whole field according to the source?
Okay, key trends highlighted are taking a holistic approach, trying to see interconnectedness, being highly empirical, really grounding conclusions in detailed observation and evidence. Conducting in-depth studies over significant periods of time, often using multiple methods, seeing a dynamic relationship between very specific local observations and broader compiled knowledge, and constantly using the comparative method, comparing across different cultures, societies, and time periods.
Okay, that gives us a really good framework.
Yeah.
Now let's get into some of the specifics. The source lists so many fascinating subfields. We probably can't cover them all, but maybe we can highlight a few that really show the range.
Good idea. Let's pick some that showcase different facets. On the sociocultural side, a really fundamental concept the source discusses is cultural relativism.
Ah, yes, that's about understanding cultures on their own terms, isn't it? Not judging them by our own standards.
Exactly that. It's the principle that you should try to understand beliefs and practices within their specific cultural context before making judgments. The source emphasizes it's crucial for avoiding bias and simplistic comparisons when looking across cultures, a core ethical and methodological stance.
And closely linked to that is ethnography, right? You mentioned participant observation.
Yes, ethnography is central. It's both the process of doing that long-term immersive field work, the participant observation.
Living with the community.
Right. And it's also the product, usually a detailed written account, like a book or monograph, that comes out of that research, aiming to provide a rich, nuanced understanding of that specific cultural world.
So it's about depth and nuance, not just quick surveys. Okay, what about something really fundamental like kinship? how families and relationships are structured.
Kinship is a classic anthropological topic because, well, it's a human universal. Every society has rules and patterns for defining family, descent, marriage,
But they vary hugely, right?
hugely. And anthropologists study that variation, how descent is traced through the mother's line, father's line, both, what marriage rules exist, what counts as family. The source even mentions the distinction between consanguinity or blood ties and the idea of chosen family, people you form close kin-like bonds with who aren't biological
Which
relatives.
is very relevant today.
Very. It shows kinship is as much about social and cultural construction as it is about biology.
That's a great example of anthropology unpacking something we might take for granted. What about economics? Does anthropology look at that?
Absolutely. Economic anthropology. It started out looking a lot at things like gift giving, reciprocity, non market economies in smaller scale societies. Think Malinowski and Massus on the gift.
Okay.
But it's evolved way beyond that. Now, economic anthropologists bring a critical lens to, well, all economic systems. The source mentions recent work focusing on things like corporations, banks, global finance, applying anthropological methods like ethnography to understand the cultures within those institutions.
Doing ethnography at a Wall Street bank, that sounds fascinating and challenging.
Definitely a different kind of field work, but it yields unique insights into how those systems actually operate on a human level.
Let's jump to something that connects biology and culture. You mentioned biocultural anthropology earlier.
Yes, this is a really important area. It directly explores that interplay between human biology and culture. The source highlights a key shift here, moving away from older, often racist ideas about fixed biological differences between groups,
Why?
towards understanding how culture actively shapes our biology. Think about diet, subsistence strategies, social stress, exposure to disease. These cultural and environmental factors have profound biological effects over time, influencing everything from growth patterns to disease susceptibility.
So culture isn't just layered on top of biology, they're intertwined.
Deeply intertwined, that's the core message.
And looking way back in time, archaeology,
Yeah.
what's a specific example from paleoanthropology that the source mentions?
Paleoanthropology combines fossil studies with physical anthropology to understand our ancient ancestors. The source gives a concrete example, studying the teeth of Homo luzonensis, an ancient human species found in the Philippines.
What can teeth tell us?
A surprising amount. By looking at the size, shape, wear patterns, even the chemical isotopes in the enamel, researchers can infer things about their diet, behavior, maybe even developmental patterns. Those tiny details in fossils help piece together the big picture of human evolution.
It's amazing how much information can be gleaned from something like a tooth. Really brings the past closer.
It does. It shows how anthropology uses very specific empirical data to tackle these huge questions about who we are and where we came from.
This all naturally leads to thinking about responsibility, doesn't it? Studying people, especially their past and their present lives. The source mentions ethics quite a bit.
Yes, ethics is a huge consideration. The source notes that professional anthropological associations have developed pretty detailed ethical codes. These are meant to guide researchers in their responsibilities, primarily towards the people they study, but also towards the discipline and even their own safety. Protecting subjects is paramount.
And you mentioned earlier the field grapples with its own history, the colonial connections.
Absolutely. The source is clear that this is an ongoing critical discussion. It explicitly mentions the debate about whether and how anthropology was involved with, or even used by, colonial powers and state policies. It's not a settled issue, but acknowledged as a crucial part of the field's history to confront.
There have been other ethical controversies too, haven't there? Particularly around involvement with military or intelligence agencies.
Yes, the source touches on a history here. It mentions Franz Boas, a founding figure, strongly objecting to anthropologists acting as spies during World War I.
Wow.
Then, contrastingly, many anthropologists did work in intelligence during World War II. Later, there were concerns about surveillance during the Cold War and significant anti-war activism among anthropologists during the Vietnam War.
And more recently.
More recently, the source details the controversy around the U.S. military's Human Terrain System, or HTS program, in Iraq and Afghanistan. This involved embedding social scientists, including anthropologists, with military units.
That sounds ethically complicated.
Extremely. The source reports on the American Anthropological Association's investigation. Their conclusion, as presented in the source, was that the HTS program was fundamentally incompatible with anthropological ethics.
Why was that?
The AAA report cited several reasons. The military mission potentially determining the research agenda, a lack of proper informed consent and potential harm to local populations, the inability to ensure confidentiality, and the generally coercive environment. It highlights the ongoing tension and debate within the field about engagement with powerful institutions, especially the military.
So these are not easy questions the field is asking itself.
Not at all. They are complex and constantly being debated.
Okay, so we've covered this incredible scope, the history, the methods, the subfields, even the tough ethical debates. Let's bring it back to the listener. What does all this mean for you? Why should you care about this deep dive into anthropology today?
Well, one key point the source makes is that anthropology isn't just about studying faraway places anymore. It increasingly studies topics and peoples very close to the author's home, as the source puts it.
Studying Western societies, you mean cities, institutions.
Exactly. Studying urban life, migration, corporations, science labs, NGOs, online communities, the connections between different places in our globalized world. Anthropology is turning its lens onto all aspects of contemporary life everywhere.
So connecting back to you, our listener, this matters because understanding this huge range of human behavior, biology, culture, society, past and present, is really fundamental to understanding ourselves and the incredibly diverse, complex world we all live in now.
It really is. Anthropology offers this unique perspective, doesn't it? It's holistic, trying to see the bigger picture. It's deeply comparative, showing us the vast range of human possibility. And it's grounded in that rich, empirical, often long-term research.
Which helps you move beyond simple answers or stereotypes.
Precisely. It equips you with tools to think critically about things like globalization, social inequality, health disparities, conflict, environmental issues, technology, by providing context, showing different perspectives, highlighting the many ways people navigate the world and make meaning in their lives.
It feels like it really challenges assumptions about what's normal or natural for humans by showing just how incredibly varied we are.
That's a great way to put it. It encourages critical thinking about human experience in all its fascinating, sometimes contradictory complexity.
Well, that was quite a journey through the sprawling, multifaceted world of anthropology, from its Greek name origins to its modern subfields and critical debates.
Yeah, we've really only been able to, scratch the surface of what's in this rich source material you provided. But hopefully we've pulled out some of the key ideas and given you a good sense of the field.
Absolutely. It's truly incredible how much ground it covers. You really get that conglomerate discipline feeling.
Thinking about it, one thing the source mentions is how biological anthropologists, for example, are interested in both human universals.
Things potentially shared by all humans.
Right. Behaviors, cognitive abilities, maybe certain social patterns, things found across virtually all cultures. But they're also intensely interested in human variation, the biological and cultural differences between groups and individuals.
That tension again between what might unite us all and what makes us so diverse.
Exactly. And that, perhaps, leaves us with a final thought for you to consider after this deep dive.
Okay.
In a world that often feels incredibly polarized and divided, what does this anthropological focus, this insistence on looking at both the profound depth of cultural variation and the possibility of underlying human universals tell us about our shared humanity? What can we learn from holding both those ideas at the same time?
That's a perfect question to ponder, a great place to leave it. Until our next deep dive, keep exploring and keep questioning.